Well, then why does Paul say here in Romans 9 that God gives mercy to some and to others he hardens? And the classical example of God hardening is the hardening of Pharaoh's heart in the Old Testament. That's a difficult one, and I only have about a minute and a half to answer it, so I'll try to do it quickly. That even when we speak of hardening, we have to distinguish between active hardening and passive hardening, or what we would call direct hardening or indirect hardening. There are two ways that God can harden the heart of Pharaoh. One is that he could come down, intrude into Pharaoh's life, and create evil in the heart of Pharaoh in order for God to accomplish his purposes. He could make Pharaoh sin. But if he does that, then what? How could God, if he's just and righteous, force Pharaoh to sin and then punish him for that sin? That would make God the author of sin, which is an absolute no-no, biblically. But there's another way Pharaoh can have his heart hardened. Remember that Pharaoh is a sinner. And all of us are sinners. But all of us have our sin, to some degree, checked and restrained by certain opposition around us that keeps us from being utterly depraved. When men achieve levels of power where they become outside the bounds of normal restraints, their ability to sin freely increases. I mean, the only thing that's keeping Pharaoh from being utterly wicked is the restraining power of God. It certainly wasn't the government of Egypt that was keeping him in check. Only God's restraints were keeping Pharaoh from being more wicked than he actually was. If God wants to harden Pharaoh's heart, does God have to create fresh evil there? All he has to do is remove his hands and give Pharaoh all the space he needs. And that's how Pharaoh's heart is hardened, which is itself an act of divine judgment, a just act of divine judgment upon him. And the gospel does the same thing in the lives of the reprobate. The more people hear the gospel and freely reject it, the more their hearts become hardened. And so that you see that in this drama, Pharaoh hardens his own heart. All God does is remove the restraints. And so Pharaoh is responsible for the hardening of his heart. And so again, we see that in this scheme, in the concept of election, all men are fallen, all men are wicked. God gives mercy to some, as in the case of Jacob. And the others he leaves to themselves. They receive justice. This group receives mercy, that God might be honored and that God's purposes might stand.